Welcome to another edition of Close Strong, the enterprise sales show. And I'm Brian Deepmyer, CEO of Close Strong. And today we are all lucky to be with Dustin Ruge, the sitting president of Law Leaders. Dustin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate you having me.
Last week, you and I were chatting, wandered into the notion of building culture and enterprise sales teams. And then I recognized you're an author on this subject and said, hey, we should talk about this. I think it's a cool subject. It's one I would personally like to learn more about. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about this. So let's dive in. Great. I want to hear the super high level question, but how would you define culture, right? Is it a soft skill or is it something we can really get our arms around?
Yeah. First off, it's a great question. This is a great topic because if you ask 10 people what they consider culture to be, by definition, you're going to probably get 10 different answers,
yes.
Which is part of the problem, which I think is a great question of why you're asking that. So we all kind of know what culture is when we go into organizations. If you've been around long enough, like Brian, you and I have, you've seen good and bad cultures, right? And you can distinguish them. And but a lot of times people have a hard time understanding what they are and how they exist. But you know what they are when you're there, right? Are they productive? Or are they toxic type cultures or things like that? So ultimately, in my mind, when I look at culture, is ultimately how all people, whether they be the employees, the customers, or vendors, experience an organization or a brand. And that's the easiest way for me to think about and articulate what is culture to me. And ultimately, as part of that, you're talking about a shared subset of values, beliefs, attitudes, feelings, trust, systems, purpose, norms, etc. They're all things that are the culture. And a perfect example of there's companies that do this really well and understand what culture is and actually define it. One of those is a company called HubSpot. If people aren't familiar with that, they actually have what's called a culture code, where they define and write down what the culture is and then curate that over time for their organization. So it can be defined, but it's difficult oftentimes to come up with a single subset of, okay, what is culture? But even though, and then the other part of that question that you had was, I think, is that a soft skill as opposed to something you can measure? It is difficult to quantify, especially in the traditional KPI metrics of organizations and what they use. But we all know that there's a profound impact around that. But, really, when you're looking at your traditional KPIs within an organization, oftentimes missing from that are the things that culture does either directly or indirectly impact. But those things are changing now. With newer technologies, new awareness around this, we're now looking at things like employee engagement, satisfaction scores, collaboration, productivity, in ways in which that we haven't been able to look at before, that now allow us to get a better understanding of what is culture within an organization, and more importantly, how to measure and manage that moving forward.
Yeah, I really appreciate that definition, because you're right. I asked the question because the question was actually mine, and
Sure.
you made me think of a couple of things. Like I think to the last corporate position I had in a Fortune 50, and a lot of the organizations I've gone in. Now I recognize, like, there's a lot of culture by accident. Like, I worked in an organization where the culture was operational. Why was it operations culture? Because all the people in ops tended to come to the top, to corporate headquarters, and then there's finance cultures. And so I realized that's kind of just an aggregate by chance culture. But then I think about the other side. So one of our institutional investors, Proda, has this thing called Geek, and it's generous, empathetic, kind. I'm trying to remember what the other E is for. But they ask, I guess this is operationalizing that. They ask the question many times, is this geek, what we're doing right here? And we're allowed to ask them. So is that, like, making that operationally, that seems to be, that I guess that would be a super key part of really making this thing stick.
It is. And, you have to, going back to what you mentioned before, whether it's intentional or not, that's part of the problem within many organizations is good leadership, good cultures are built intentionally.
Yes.
and they're done so, and they're oftentimes a shadow of the leader that set those mantras in place. And let me give you a perfect example. Southwest Airlines. We've all had miserable flying experiences, right? I live in a hub for Southwest Airlines, and one of the things I noticed just recently was I had to fly two legacy airlines normally that I don't fly, right? Because I had
Yes.
a recent business trip at a conference, and what I noticed was the stark difference just in culture between the organizations, and you see that through the contrast principle, which is sometimes if you live within a culture, you don't know whether or not it's a good culture. You haven't experienced the opposite of that.
Right.
But it's an easy way to do that, especially with airlines, where I got on two legacy carriers, and I will not name them by name to get them in trouble. But the point was, you couldn't have asked for a more different experience in that what I observed with how they interact amongst themselves, and more importantly, with the passengers, right? And how their processes and procedures took place. It was dramatically different than what I'm used to, for example, with Southwest Airlines. And Southwest Airlines is one of the only corporations that actually has a department dedicated to preserving their culture. And it is something that Herb Culler
Hmm.
had, who was the co-founder of Southwest Airlines, instituted when he first started Southwest Airlines, and it still survives to this day, even beyond Herb Culler as their CEO.
Yeah, so much of this is coming alive for me as you're talking. I was fortunate enough to work for Marriott Hotels for many years, many years, and Bill Marriott was big on culture, because that was kind of my first job, and I worked my way up and stayed there for 17 years, and it was a really strong culture. I thought that's the way every place ran, right? And then I went in and started consulting to other organizations with this mindset, But you're right. It came from Bill Marriott, and I believe one of his sons for a while was in charge of keeping that culture alive as the company grew. So yeah, you're helping me to gain clarity that this is actually a ton more tangible than. So how about let's talk about upsides or downsides of culture related to selling. Like, what can a bad culture do to enterprise sales teams, and what does a good culture look like in enterprise sales teams?
Yeah, great question. So the upsides are pretty obvious, and we see these even in statistics. We know, for example, engaged sales teams typically perform at a 20% higher rate than those that aren't on the medium, right? So, first part is obviously it improves engagement. The other part of that is and something a lot of companies need to pay really close attention to is something called the voluntary turnover rates in their organization, especially amongst their salespeople. It's one thing to look at, okay, what is your turnover rate within an organization, but what really happens when you lose good people, when they willingly leave your organization? What
Yes.
are the impacts of that? And that has a 20% impact as well for organizations that have ultimately higher engagement scores and better cultures. And then the final thing is there is an ultimate impact on, when you have all these things happen, on sales performance, on net revenue retention, and things of that area. So the upsides are significant for a company. Oftentimes they hire, and they see this despite that, but it is a integral component to the process of what they're trying to accomplish to improve the organization. Now, there are downsides as well. The downsides are pretty obvious when you think about what our organizations dealing with today. One of the facts that always stunned me years ago when I wrote, in fact, my last book for I Quit, was that 2/3 of employees right now are consider themselves not engaged in their work. So when you think about that, what that means from a productivity perspective, that's $1 billion, multiple billions of dollars of impact negatively on organizations. And then there's also that old saying that, people quit bosses, not companies. And when you
Yes.
think about what that means, there's also a opposite of that as well, which is not only do they leave bad managers, but they come to good managers. So, even though there's a negative impact on organizations, they can also use that as a strength if they build cultures and what have out there. So it's interesting when you look at a lot of these younger people now, when they're Googling and looking for places they want to work, they're actually Googling for companies with best cultures, because this
Yeah.
is what they want to join. It is a selling point for them. And then, finally, ultimately, the downside is where you see all the results of these problems, usually in productivity, profitability, and turnover costs, right? And you see those reflected in slowing revenue and downstream client retention problems. But unfortunately, a lot of those tend to be after the damage has been done, but the impacts are certainly there. And that's why smart organizations try to get in front of this, as opposed to ones that just get reactionary to it, and that's where they run into problems.
I wonder, I'm becoming more fascinated by this subject as we talk. So so I'm going to ask you a rookie question. In my last business, like we had I don't know if we wanted to call it values. We're a company that's run by good people who are smart people. And that was always my dream. Like, can I surround myself in my corporate life? There's a lot of bright people I didn't like and a lot of people I loved who weren't that bright. I'm like, this is nirvana. Can we do both? And I remember about halfway through that business, I had a couple who were really smart and were bringing in a lot of revenue, but they weren't necessarily good people. And I had one of my teammates call me out and say, "What about the good people thing, dude? Like, why are they still here?" And I shot them both, and it was painful. And is that so? It occurred to me. I mean, is that can the culture be is like define the North Star as simple as like this geek thing or good people who are smart people, but then it's the actions that prove it out that make it legitimate. Can it be that simple as a statement?
Well, it could be. I guess in my opinion, you could have the unicorn that is both, right? But
Yeah.
unfortunately, you have like right benders in organizations, and that's what makes organizational management so complex in today's business world, right? Is
Yes.
how to deal with these problems. In the end, though, you have to have values within an organization's an ethos of how you operate, and you don't have to be the brightest north star to have those. And I've even worked in organizations where, quite honestly, there probably wasn't the smartest person at the top or within these responsibilities, but they were the right people because they were the people that people wanted to work for.
Yes.
And oftentimes they were the ones that brought in even brighter people under them, which again is part of a great culture. Is when somebody's not intimidated by those that are working for them, but rather, and they don't want to be the smartest person in the room, but rather want to bring in those
Hmm.
people they know can make that puzzle work and make that organization more efficient.
Interesting. Again, back to one of my few life heroes, Bill Marriott. Bill Marriott used to say every decision we make is either a withdrawal deposit into brand equity. And he talked to both associates and customers. And that was one of those ones where I won't go into the details, but I was in a meeting where we were struggling with a decision and he came in and said that. And we were like, boom, short term cash flow. We're going to make this decision that's going to hurt short term, but it's brand equity. So now I realize maybe that's why that brand equity was so strong or the culture was so strong there. You made a correlation a couple days ago that I thought was interesting about the way most organizations find sales leaders is the rock stars. And you made a correlation between sort of culture and that, unless I'm misparaphrasing, if that's a word. So what is the correlation between sort of growing your sales leaders that way and how that impacts culture?
Yeah, it's a very, very important topic. In fact, it was one of the reasons why I published my first of my 5 books was on sales management and how to do this, because there's so few people that know how to do this and do it really well. The unfortunate part with organizations, both large and small, is that they do exactly what you just said, Brian. That they take their top salespeople and
Yeah.
they promote them into a sales leadership position. But the problem is the most of the people that are making that determination are measuring them based upon their individual sales performance as opposed to their skills and leadership ability as a sales leader. And the trouble with that is when they look at the skill sets, there are common skill sets amongst salespeople and sales managers, but there are a lot of different ones as well. And some of those different ones are really a defining characteristic of what makes a good sales leader and what doesn't. And let me give you some examples of that. And I write about this in my
Yes.
first book. What are the things that I look for example, and recommend that people look for when they look at sales managers? The first one is, do they work well and communicate with others? We know we classify salespeople oftentimes in certain buckets, right? And one of those buckets are things like lone wolf. You're going to have a
Yes.
lot of salespeople that independently operate very efficiently. But the problem is, can they do that collaboratively now? Will they be able to work with other people and support them and make them work well? Another part of great sales management is the ability to articulate the why of the business
Yep.
to the sales organization that you're working within. In other words, anybody could bark down orders, but the problem is, can somebody articulate that in a professional way so that your sales organization or your people actually understand what it is and why these things are happening, as opposed to just do this and just do that, right? There are other aspects such as, are they problem solvers as opposed to complainers? We all know the difference, right? Complainers don't make good managers. Can they handle high levels of stress with others, right? We all know in sales, everybody deals with stress, but can you deal with stress with others as opposed to just internalizing it yourself? Do you have a high degree of integrity and respect? Let's be honest. We're in sales, right? Not everybody in sales has the highest level of degrees of integrity at times. The problem is sometimes those people can be top performers. And are those the right people that are going to be able to garner the type of trust that your sales organization needs to be able to trust and follow them moving forward? Can they fairly manage people? The military, for years, the military has had rules about when they promote people from the enlisted ranks into the officer ranks, where they can't be an officer amongst their same units. And the reason why is, they want to make sure that there's fairness as well as respect within the ranks of doing that. And we've all, if you've been around a while, Brian, like we have, I'm sure you've seen managers come in that unfortunately have, they don't always treat everybody fair, right? They have favorites. They tilt things in certain directions, which has negative cultural implications for the team. And then probably the most important thing of all, and I know we talked about this in our last conversation, is can a great salesperson know what a great salesperson is? And can they find that in other people? And the reason why is there are some really good salespeople that, and more importantly, understand that people can sell in different ways, right? What might be their strength might be a weakness for other people. And how can they bring out this strength in each person relative to their own skill sets and what they can do to be able, and then how do you go out and find them? I often say, and I've wrote about this in my books, that your number one job as a sales manager is a recruiter. Your job is to build the best team possible. The analogy is with sports teams, right? What do? They have entire organizations going out just identifying talent that they can bring into their organization. That's your job. That's your responsibility. And you need to be doing that all the time in order to be able to find these people. And if you can't do that, it doesn't matter how good salesperson you are. If you don't have people under you that can't run the race.
Man, I have so many questions for you. I'm given our limit, I really do. And it's funny too, because talking to you, Dustin, you're pulling me back to an organization I worked for with great culture, and now I'm realizing how they did that on purpose, right? And Bill Marriott used to say that the things that lead to success are the same things that will lead to your failure if you keep. And I think about this problem that almost everybody I talk to is we're promoting our best salespeople. And my boss, back when I got promoted to VP level, he said, you've been a rock star. That's why you got this job. Your job is now to develop rock stars. Right. And my head sort of exploded. Like I just summed up a lot of that conversation we were having and remembered Roger saying that to me and saying, wow, that's an entirely different skill. Right. But thing made me look at it differently.
Well, and just to add to what you said, Brian, and think about a moment ago with Bill Marriott, right? He's looking at the long-term outlook of the business, the organization, right?
Yeah.
That's another problem that culture can help counteract. Is too often, especially in publicly traded companies now, we're very myopic, right? We're this month or the next quarter, or at most the next year. But a lot of these decisions have long-term implications that these people need to think beyond the short-term revenue gains or how they're being addressed in the KPI side. That's what leadership too is, especially in a culture like Bill's playing the long game, right?
Yes.
He understands what the organization's trying to do, as opposed to somebody who's just saying, you know what, I'm just trying to make sure I'm employed next year.
Yeah. Yeah. And there would be a whole nother, as we say in the Midwest, a whole nother podcast on the relationship between public companies and reporting and culture, right? Those things somewhat at odds, which is the point you were just making. Are there any common mistakes people make as it relates to culture?
Yeah, in my experience, there's a number of them, and we've already touched on one, right? Which is, most organizational cultures start with the shadow of their leaders. If the organization doesn't already have an ensconced mores right now or ethos in place, like Southwest does, it's survived Herb Kohler, right? Everybody that comes in now is constantly reminded of the ghost of Herb because his shadow's still there. And probably the same thing with Marriott, to your story, Brian, about Bill Marriott and other people like that. But the problem that first organizations need to understand is that the cultures really are the shadow of the leaders within the organizations. And either they form their own that they model, reinforce, and enforce behaviors on within the organization, or the organization does that upon them, right? Depending upon the strength of the individual and the strength of the culture within the organization. In other words, if there's a vacuum in the organization, they're going to be more likely to take on the culture of the individual. And the problem with that is going to be the first thing is it's hard to measure culture in a traditional sense, as we talked about earlier, right? And then you often have to look about what are the long-term solutions that this solves in a short-term driven world, right? And then you've got the chicken and the egg problem with a lot of
Yeah.
senior management, which is where should this come in and at what levels and what causes what. And the other problem with this has to deal with, and I've seen this firsthand many times, is there's very little consideration given when hiring senior leadership around culture. In other words, they look at the hard skills or the experiences or the accomplishments of individuals and don't really give a good consideration as to how good of a fit individual based upon what we want to be as an organization culturally. And oftentimes we've seen the results of that, and it's a terrible mismatch, right? You could have all the talent in the world, all the hard skills in the world, but when you come in, if you don't have people that want to work for you, you're going to create a work environment, and then ultimately it's going to be too late. And a lot of companies try to measure this historically by running NPS scores and surveys, right? Everybody's done this. I'm sure everybody who's listening to this is probably shaking their heads. And most companies do this usually semi-annually or annually. And what I've found in my own experience is that not only are these scores too latent, in other words, these might be done 6 or 12 months after the damage has been done, but oftentimes the participation rates aren't good. And in toxic environments, people are afraid to actually provide
Yes.
feedback, which is
Yeah.
your first indication that there's a problem communicating. If you've got low participation scores on your surveys and your MPSs, that's your first indication you've got a
Right.
cultural problem.
It's
Is because
your
people
first
are,
data point. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, because people are afraid to communicate
Yes.
openly and willingly within the environment. So a
It
lot of things there that break down.
Yeah, it also occurs to me, you used the word enforce, which I wrote down, and also evidence. I feel like in listening to you talk about this, like you can have that stated culture, but it comes down to the behaviors. Like, are we making decisions that are filtered through that? That's the evidence. I think if people are going to buy in, at least for me, I'm going back to a place where I bought in, and it's because decisions were made. This wasn't a placard on a wall.
Right, exactly. And that's why I like what companies like Southwest and HubSpot have done is they codified what their culture is, and then they make that as part of a standard performance management process for all individuals within an organization. So when you think about this, when you lack those types of things and there's a cultural problem, do you open yourself up to liability as an organization? Somebody go by saying you're not a good cultural fit within the organization. If there's that much ambiguity around it, they're not going to do it. And
Yeah,
HR is not going to recommend it. And therefore, you're going to have the toxicity just spread.
exactly.
Whereas
Yeah.
opposed to if you codify this in a way that is part of your performance management, then is clearly articulated that these are one of the ways in which we measure your performance within the organization.
So you mentioned surveys. Does technology play any role in like distributing and managing culture other than surveys?
Yeah, there's quite a few that are just emerging, especially with the new AI technologies. It's fantastic. Let me give you a couple examples of tools that I've seen and worked with recently that I absolutely think are fantastic in helping with culture. The first one is around employee engagement. As I talked about before, right? 2/3 of people are engaged. It's a huge number that everybody's trying to get their hands around. Again, we failed largely organizationally by doing surveys and NPS scores and things of that nature. However, there are new technologies out there, one of which I just recently worked with called Maxwell, which basically is an AI large language model technology system. And what it does is it monitors the communications anonymously within organizations and then is able to give you real time monitorization and trends based upon levels of employee mood, employee engagement, productivity, collaboration. And they're able to do this not only organizational, but within nodes of the organization all the way down to teams.
Wow.
And think about what the implications of that are and how huge that is. Because a lot of people, when they hear what I'm saying, might say, well, that's spying, or, that we don't want people doing that. When I say, first off, I think these systems work best when they're anonymous. So we're not talking about an individual. But what it does is it gives you a real read on what's going on organizationally, and then how you can contrast that both internally within different nodes of your organizations and externally within your competition or other people within the industry to see how you compete. So one is there's a lot of these great large language model tools that are coming out like Maxwell now that are fantastic, that I think are going to completely do away with the need to do latent surveys and NPS scores in the future. There's also now AI is touching into these recording services. And I know you and I talked about this last time before. There's a number of tools out there like Gong that historically used to record your sales conversations so you could help coach and manage your salespeople. Well, they're now taking that a step further by analyzing that information, comparing it, categorizing it, looking for keywords, looking for durations. When do, for example, competitors' names come up within sales conversations? How quickly does pricing come up in conversations? All these things that now you can really deep dive into the data analytics of a sale to be able to help you more efficiently manage the people that you're working with and the culture in which you're dealing with, so that you don't have to be monitoring and micromanaging people, but rather
Yeah.
doing this much more strategically and effectively with how they do that. There's also other tools around incentives. Incentives aren't new, right? Incentives you can provide both internally and to clients. There's tools out there like, Alice and Sendoso and others that I've used recently that not only allow you to use technology to automate and send out information, but they can now analyze the profiles of the individuals that you want to gift. For example, if I have a new client or somebody I'm trying to open the door with, they'll go out and scour the social profiles of individuals, look at their alma maters, everything to tell you what is it exactly that's going to trigger these people, that it's going to make them, appreciate what you're giving, as opposed to just have it look like a token anything, right?
Right.
So those are that are out there. Another thing that I really like within organizations to do is also to continue the learning process for individuals. We know that employee retention is directly correlated to their ability to grow and get better within their sales role, or in this case, any role within an organization. So one of the best ways to do that is there's a whole bunch of online learning tools that you can subscribe to for your employees. You can even give them credits. So these would be credits, for example, that you can use for continual learning to continue to get better. Google started doing this a long time ago, where they even carved out times where they said, you have this amount of time as an employee to work on the things you want to work on, right? Give them that entrepreneurial spirit to be able to do the things you're doing, as opposed to getting burned out from the things you're not doing, but always trying to get better. And then the final part of that is and again, this isn't new, but a lot of companies don't do it, is customer feedback automation and employee feedback automation. And what are the impacts of this? I remember years ago, the head of Salesforce was speaking to a conference that I was at, and he was talking about how 70% of the new product features come straight from the customers, from a simple link at the bottom of the Salesforce system, allowing people to tell them, and them then categorizing and prioritizing what they're going to put in as new features and functions within the organization. Well, very good open door, good communication companies, again, back to what we talked about earlier, where they're not toxic, but rather open doors. You know the difference a lot of times when, for example, and if I go into an organization and I say, if you want to provide feedback that is strategic to the organization, how is that communication? How do you do that now? And when I continuously hear from organizations say, well, I'm supposed to tell my manager. Well, that's your first problem. Is
Right.
yes, there's a chain of command, but there should be a way of sharing communication more effectively and efficiently with the organization. You'd be shocked at how many, especially larger organizations, have no tools, no facilitation for anybody to openly share communication and feedback of ways in which they can get better beyond going through a chain of command, which we all know is only as effective as every link in that chain.
Yeah.
Right. And then ultimately, because of the culture, the more toxic the culture, the less likely that open communication is going to be moving up. And that's where you're going to be running into problems. So there are technologies that have existed, and now there's new technologies with AI that I've seen that are great to deploy to be able to support cultural, opportunities moving
Yeah.
forward.
The Maxwell thing is kind of fascinating to me. So the other thing about too is I go back to Marriott. It was a balanced scorecard. It was for ability, it was guest satisfaction and associate satisfaction. And that was like way back in the day. And it's like, if you were making a bunch of money and yeah, your customers are happy, but you're killing your associates, like you didn't hit your number. So yeah, I
Right.
I like that a lot. So
I love that. That is fantastic. And you're right, because a lot of great organizations, what I've seen is they'll value their employees as much as they value the customers. And let's be
yeah.
honest, how many companies actually do that today?
Yep. I grew up in one and thought that happened everywhere, and learned quickly that's not the case. So what's the top couple things people should be doing tomorrow to think about their culture, if you were stuck between two and three?
Only two or three, huh?
Yeah.
So there's probably a few things I would suggest in my experience. One is, as I alluded to previously, you need to define and publish your culture, and that starts with, with at a company level, you need to have a purpose, a vision, values, and mission. Right. Every company should have that one iteration or another to understand what is the purpose of the organization. What are you trying to do? And by the way, this is not hard to do anymore. And think about the companies I was just talking about earlier, like Southwest Airlines and Google, and we talked about HubSpot with they have a culture code, et cetera. You even go into like any industry this can be impactful on. Chick-fil-A is a perfect example. Your experience, my experiences when I go into Chick-fil-A are vastly different than any other fast food chain, right? Because of the way they treat their people, the way they treat themselves. And as a result of that, they have record growth earnings. They have record retention of employees. Google's the same way.
Yes.
Google was very smart a long time ago when they determined that they are fighting for a limited pool of skilled talent, especially around Silicon Valley. So it wasn't just pay anymore that would keep them. What do they need to do? So they created a culture that allowed them to have things like free food and kitchens and workspaces and the way they organizationally structure and allow people again to have that free time to innovate and work. These are all things that are cultural that companies are doing that you can emulate. You don't have to think of all of this on your own. The final thing I would recommend in that first aspect is when you create this, you don't have to reinvent the wheel anymore either. I mentioned earlier that HubSpot has a published culture code. You can actually Google it and look it up. Just put HubSpot culture code and read it. But the cool thing about that is HubSpot, which was one of the great things about HubSpot, is they love to publish information and become thought leaders and everything. They actually published their template that you can now download for your organization to create your own culture code within your organization. So the template's already there. All you have to do is follow a model that's worked very well. I had heard from them that there was over 6 million views of their culture code. And they don't have 6 million employees. So there's a lot of attention around what they're doing and how they're doing it right. Some of the other areas that I would think would be really important, and I talk about this in my last book, is start asking questions. And when I say that, the first thing I always try to determine with an organization, a health organization, is do they do exit interviews when people leave, especially people that voluntarily leave an organization. You will be shocked at how many people don't, how many organizations don't. Or if they do it, it's relegated to a low-level HR person. The information goes nowhere, et cetera. What you need to do is give a very, very concentrated effort around your voluntary people that leave the organization and then track the trends and give heightened visibility. These should be in your core HR KPIs that roll up no less than every month so they can see trends when they're visibly happening. So that, again, they're not getting too far behind the wake. A couple other things that you should do not only within your organization, but when you hire. So for example, in my last book, I have 10 questions that every company should, or every employee should ask when they're interviewing with a company, because it's just as critical for you to ask the right questions as it is for them to ask the right questions of you. And a number of those questions are all around culture. And let me read you a couple of these that I just pulled straight out of my book. The one is, how would you describe the culture of this business and what do people like the most about working here? Now, when you think about that, nobody's going to have a canned answer to that. And if you ask enough people when you're interviewing, you want to pay close attention to what comes, because it's going to be Occam's razor. They're going to be telling you what comes off their mind, and their response or their lack thereof is going to give you the answer you need to determine what kind of culture exists within that organization. Another question I always ask or recommend people ask is, what are the top 3 reasons previous employees have provided when leaving the organization? Now, again, if you're doing exit interviews and doing it properly, they're going to have an answer to this. But you also want to ask this for everybody you're talking to, because you want to hear from them. What are the reasons that people are leaving here? And does any of that have to do with culture? Because if it does, that's a critical component, because it's really hard to change, especially if it's a shadow, right? If it's an individual that's been running the organization for a long time, you're going to have a hard time getting around that, as opposed to other issues that might be easier to deal with. Some of the other things I know you asked, I'm just going to fire down some of the things that come off the top of my head. Another one, as we previously talked about, is deploying listening services, as we talked about before. The tools like Maxwell keep tabs and trends of employee engagement and levels and their trends. I'm sorry. You need to evolve beyond surveys. If your company is still doing surveys and net promoter scores, you're already behind. There's technologies out there, utilize them, plug them in, and they're actually much cheaper and much more efficient now to run than using these traditional tools that really provide very bad information or latent information that becomes unactionable. Another thing that I often tell, make sure that you train your people leaders cultural best practices. Don't just tell them what it is.
Yeah.
You know, you set the example. Or if you work within an organization and you're a segment leader, or you're just even running a sales team, do things like I do, right? Is set culture, if you will, within your organization. And that includes things like clear and open communication, always being accessible, right? Having constant improvement and learning processes going on. Let me give you an example. When you have sales teams, one of the things I like to do every week is I always have a training for the teams. And it's always something to learn something new, something better, bringing in subject experts, or even asking sometimes salespeople, you want to get better at something, to train other people how to do it, so that it forces them to learn, because teaching forces learning, right? Give promotional team collaboration. So, do things like mentoring, put swim buddy systems in place, run sales contests. Salespeople are naturally competitive. They like to compete. And you should be able to give that within your own node to be able to make that successful. Celebrate achievement. A lot of organizations don't realize this, and this is from the context of sales, right? A lot of people don't realize that when they're working there, they're also building up their resume and their backgrounds, right? For example, does your company have a President's Club program? If not, why? And what kind of lift can you get out of this? I've done ROI models for companies on President's Clubs, and they were shocked to determine how much more revenue they can get just simply by using celebratory actions and accomplishments, because these are things that top salespeople look for, right? They want to be that person that achieves that. Showing sales stacks openly so that people can see how they're performing, giving recognition. And then one of the most important things I usually talk to about with people is make sure that your high level accomplishments that you're providing are non-mutually exclusive. One of the biggest mistakes I've seen companies do is they'll say, well, we're going to send only our top 5 people to President's Club. It's the worst way to build a culture, because what you're ultimately doing is, instead of having them collaborate, you're actually having them compete against each other mutually exclusively. And they're doing that by not helping each other. And that's the last thing you want. So you want to set markers where when anybody can potentially achieve that. Balancing act with your finance department as to how to do that, but it can be done, and it can be successfully done. And then a couple final things are like customer value focus, right? Making sure that you're there's studies out that show that 3/4 of people indicate that reason why they buy is because of the experience of the seller, right? How much expertise was brought to the table when they were being sold to. So you want to make sure that they're articulating that well instead of just pushing products. So those are some of the things that when you're training sales managers about cultural best practice, those are things to look for that I utilize, that you can either, document down or utilize in your own way that you currently operate within an organization.
Yeah, this is as a layman just experiencing culture. Like, you've really made me think. I've been in both organizations where it is and it isn't, and it's crystal clear when you do it purposefully. So, the last question I have for you, Dustin, and it's Dan, our producer, may choose to edit this one out, but since I'm sitting here with a culture expert, I have a legit question for you. So I'm a football fan, maybe like a lot of people who might be listening, and I'm a fan, and we just traded
Ouch.
away we just traded away Justin Fields, who was a great leader, and the team really liked him, and now we're looking at the number 1 draft pick, and I'm reading some things about his leadership capabilities and how his past team felt about him. And I honestly am really struggling with this. And I've asked on social media some of my other Bears fans, like, do we want to win so bad that we'll bring that in? And I just wonder sort of what your reaction is, especially as it relates to professional sports. Do you want a quarterback who is not known for that kind of leadership? Is that worth winning games? I just, again, curious, and Dan can edit this out, but what's your sense on that?
This is a great question. You just reminded me of years ago, we have a that we have famous sports people speak at. And one year we had Joe Montana come speak to us. And Joe, of course, you and I are old enough to remember what the 49ers were back then. I mean, They were a dominant team with Jerry Rice, Roger Craig, all these great players. And what it reminds me of is a question similar to what happened with Joe Montana. And he was talking in particular about when they brought this guy named Jerry Rice on the team.
Yeah.
And he was a guy that came up from, he was not as well known when he came into the organization, but what he found was that one day they were doing drills and he was throwing passes and they were doing, short outs or cross routes or whatever. And he kept noticing something interesting about Jerry Rice. He said, every time I threw the ball to Jerry Rice, he wouldn't stop until he got to the end zone. Every single time, even if it was a short out play, he would run to the end zone. And then it kept going again. The coaches kept saying, Jerry, why are you doing this? He's like, I've got to get better. I've got to get better. And then what he started noticing was that other people on the team, the receivers, the other receivers and the running backs and the fullbacks, guess what they started doing every time they got the ball? They didn't stop until they got to the end zone, right? The point was, it doesn't have to be just a quarterback. Think about the impact that one individual had within that whole organization. Because after Jerry Rice came on board, I believe it was a couple of years after that, they were winning almost every Super Bowl. They were dominating teams. And could it have been Joe Montana? Perhaps. Maybe Joe was modest and giving credit to Jerry Rice. But that one story always stood out to me about it doesn't have to be just the quarterback. It can be anybody. But if they have that cultural impact on the team, everybody better in what they're doing. I'm a Nebraska fan, which means I share as much pain as you do in the Bears lately. I've been doing this for 20 years, right? But we had a guy back in our national years named Tommy Frazier, and he had the same impact. In fact, I was in school then. I knew Tommy Frazier, and he had that impact on the team, which was his mere presence, his winning ability, his ability to want to win all the time was something that lifted everybody's expectations and accomplishments. So it can be done. But usually those two people I'm talking about, they didn't know failure. And if they did, they strived beyond it. Yeah. And they set an example for everybody else to follow. I don't know who in particular you're talking about. I think I can guess who that might be. But the reality is if he hasn't achieved it yet, it's going to be tough.
He may or may not be a USC quarterback today. So.
Okay, I know exactly what you're talking about. Well, then he wants to be an owner of the team now, too, from what I understand.
Hence my point, and I'm not getting any good answers on social media. I liked yours better. You've been really generous with your time and your insights. And fascinating discussion for me, and definitely an episode that I think everybody should listen to, even if you think yours is good. You've made me rethink, am I putting enough emphasis in my own place? So thank you very much.
My pleasure, Brian. And thank you for having me. I appreciate it. This has been fun.